Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another lecture in the Birth of Learning. Tonight, we are going to be examining medieval education. And there are several different themes that we're going to see come up again and again. We're going to be examining medieval education, principally by looking at several representative figures that for me represent kind of the transition from the old Roman Empire into the medieval period, and will kind of set the tone in many ways for much that comes about during the medieval period. Of course, the medieval period is a very long one. If we were to take it kind of in its usual parameters, the Western Empire of Rome falls in the year 476 AD, and the Renaissance is typically dated to the end of the 1300s in Italy. So that period of 900 years essentially is, or something approaching that, is typically referred to as the Middle Ages. And sometimes, of course, that is broken down into the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages. Sometimes, of course, one, especially in older scholarship, would have heard the term the Dark Ages to describe us, particularly the first several centuries of that time period. Although that is a term that is no longer used, it was really a canard from the get-go. That is an insult, an aspersion cast upon the period by members of the Enlightenment. Of course, they were the enlightened ones, and the Dark Ages were just that, a time of darkness. So you can see why that is not a neutral term by any stretch. Nevertheless, what we're going to see, first of all, is that there is much, tremendous amount, in fact, going on here, culturally speaking, even from the earliest days, when there was so much upheaval and invasions and disease and loss of culture with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476. But nevertheless, what we're going to see as a major theme throughout the figures that I'm going to describe for you tonight are a great continuity. We see really two themes. There is a merger, on the one hand, of classical with Christian culture. So we see a mixture, especially in terms of the literary output of medieval authors, where they take what is best from the classical experience and adopt it and adapt it in their own forms of literature and art, and the visual arts as well, in architecture and in other ways. There is an attempt to try to bring as much of that as possible over into the new period, the Christian era. Now, of course, this does not mean that that there wasn't, especially in the early period, the early days of the Middle Ages, there wasn't a lot of regression in terms of the visual arts and archaeology, architecture, because we have to remember we're dealing with a series of centuries of violent invasions, conquerings, diseases that wipe out large portions of the population. And then you get the Vikings coming in and smashing up all sorts of things. And there's all sorts of reasons why this period of time is considered the Dark Ages. It is not because of the popular misconception that, as soon as people began to convert en masse to Christianity, then all of a sudden you just get this kind of backward, period of barbarism and superstition. That, again, is a kind of cliche from the age of the Enlightenment. No, it was because of these external factors that culture was set back in some ways, but not so much in terms of the literary output. And that is really an important point. The classical inheritance of education persists in its Christianized form, and there is a conscious bequeathing. This is the second great theme of everything I'm going to be talking about tonight. This bequeathing of classical culture to the Middle Ages, and that is principally achieved through the medium of education, through the use of the classical texts, and the essential ideal that had persisted from its inception among the ancient Greeks, so many centuries earlier, that is, of the moral and intellectual transformation of an individual through education to reach a higher level of virtue, higher level of knowledge, wisdom, an appreciation for the beautiful, the good, and the true through exposure and understanding of the problems and perspectives of philosophy, of the lessons of history, and of the beauty of literature. This is, and of course, the inculcation of critical thinking skills through the teaching of logic and the ability to put those thoughts and that critical perspective into language and present it to others. That is rhetoric, and of course to be able to. It's really grammar and rhetoric combined, and this trifecta of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the so-called trivium, is going to be the basis, really, of medieval education. It was already very much presented as the basis of education in the Roman sphere, particularly as we saw with Saint Augustine last week. And it will continue to be the basis of all education in the Middle Ages, and it will be complemented by the quadrivium, that is, the subjects of arithmetic, music, and astronomy, and the other arts that complement the basis of the trivium. So we're going to be looking tonight at a series of, as I say, representative thinkers. The first of whom is, his full Latin name would be Decimus Magnus Ausonius, otherwise known simply in English as Ausonius. He was a Roman poet. We're starting early now, so his dates are still entirely within the 4th century. A Roman poet and teacher of rhetoric from what is modern-day Bordeaux in France. This is the ancient Aquitaine. And for a time, he was tutor for the future Emperor Gratian, who afterwards bestowed the consulship on him. He is best known for his poems, the Mosella, a description of the river Moselle, and his Ephemeris, an account of a typical day in his life. His many other verses show his concern for his family, his friends, teachers, the circle of well-to-do acquaintances, and his delight in the technical handling of poetic meter. He was born in 310, as I say, in what is modern-day Bordeaux, and he was descended on both sides from established landowning Gallo-Roman families of southwestern Gaul. Ausonius was given a strict upbringing by his aunt and grandmother, both incidentally named Aemilia. He received an excellent education at Bordeaux and then again at Toulouse, where his maternal uncle, Aemilius Magnus Arborius, was a professor. So you see, he comes from a literary background. And Ausonius did well in grammar and rhetoric, but professed that his progress in Greek was unsatisfactory, a point that I think is significant in that it underscores a problem that the entire Western Middle Ages, the Middle Ages in the West would suffer from, and that is a loss of the knowledge of the Greek language. Okay, they would be cut off from so many of the primary texts of classical antiquity and so much wisdom there. We're going to be dealing with an author later on tonight, Boethius, who thankfully did translate 6 Aristotelian texts into Latin. But besides that, those were the only works that were known of Aristotle in the West up until the Arabs actually reintroduced Aristotle in the very high Middle Ages. So the loss of knowledge of the Greek language was a real setback in many ways in terms of classical culture in the West. And I keep on stressing that because in the East, the so-called Byzantine Empire, obviously the language that was spoken and was taught in the schools was Greek, so there was never a loss there. But not only that, the culture that obtained within the Byzantine Empire was one of very, very high sophistication, a very high level of classical learning, philosophy, theology, the architecture, and the other arts flourished with, really one of the bright pages of all human history. But that's another story. A period, I might add, that is much maligned, really, again, by so many modern sources who don't understand the period. Really, it's a prejudice that goes back even earlier than the Age of Enlightenment. Now, Ausonius, as I said, did well in grammar and rhetoric, And when his uncle was summoned to Constantinople to tutor one of the sons of the Emperor Constantine, Ausonius accompanied him to the capital. Having completed his studies, Ausonius trained for some time as an advocate, but he preferred teaching. In 334, he became a grammaticus, that would be an instructor at a school of rhetoric in Bordeaux. But a grammaticus would, remember, be one of the middle rung, really, of for students. So there was the literator, who was the teacher of kind of the basic literacy and numeracy and poetic texts for the young men in the Roman kind of tripartite structure of education. And then the grammaticus would be kind of like the high school, sort of middle school to high school teacher, who taught prose texts and literary studies of all kinds, but involving prose. So, understanding etymologies and grammar and so on. And then afterwards, Ausonius became a professor of rhetoric, and so this would be kind of like the college experience, where you learn how to make declamations and speeches, and learn how to use logic and look for the issues at stake in any given problem to turn into a speech. His teaching attracted many pupils, some of whom became eminent in public life, and his most famous pupil was the Christian poet and future bishop of Nola, Paulinus. Okay, and this is, I think, exactly the sort of thing that is so representative, really, of the 4th century and of this gradual conversion of empire to a Christian one, where you have classical rhetoric, classical texts all being taught, but yet now to increasingly Christian pupils. Well, after 30 years of this work, Ausonius was summoned finally by Emperor Valentinian I to teach his son, as I said, Gratian, the heir apparent. When Valentinian took Gratian on as a student, the German invasions of 368 and 369 accompanied them. And Ausonius was able to turn literary skill into political capital. In recognition of his services, Emperor Valentinian bestowed on Ausonius the rank of quaestor. This is an ancient office, but it had more of kind of ceremonial or symbolic meaning at this high point in the empire. His presence at the court gave Ausonius the opportunity to connect with a number of influential people. For instance, in 369, he met the staunch pagan and literator Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, and their friendship proved mutually beneficial. Symmachus was, if you take my class in Pagans and Christians, we do a whole lecture on him, because he was at the heart of again, in the 4th century, this battleground time, really, when the empire was. There was this great conflict, really, between the future of the empire. Would it be pagan? Would it be Christian? And Symmachus was very much part of that. Well, Gratian liked and respected his tutor so much that when he himself became emperor in 375, he began bestowing on Ausonius and his family the highest of civil honors. That year, Ausonius was made praetorian prefect of Gaul, and he actually campaigned against the Alemanni and received as part of his booty a slave girl, Besula, to whom he addressed a poem, while his father, though nearly 90 years old at this time, was given the rank of praetorian prefect of Illyrium. In 376, Ausonius' son Hesperius was made proconsul of Africa. In 379, Ausonius was awarded the consulate, the highest Roman honor. In 383, the army of Britain, led by one Magnus Maximus — if you know Latin, you'll know that phrase, that name means the best, the greatest. So obviously a person who came from really humble background and was trying to make up for it. He revolted against Gratian and assassinated him, actually, at Lyon in France, Gaul. And when Emperor Valentinian II was driven out of Italy, Ausonius retired to his estates near Bordeaux in Gaul. Ultimately, Magnus Maximus was overthrown by Emperor Theodosius I in 388, although by this point Ausonius did not leave his country estates. He said that he wanted to simply stay in his nidus senectutis, the nest of his old age, and there he spent the rest of his days composing poetry and writing to many eminent contemporaries, several of whom had been his pupils, actually. His estates supposedly included the land that is now the Chateau Ausonius, which takes its name from and makes very wonderful Bordeaux wine. The main point that I want to get across with this is that Ausonius was a Christian. Okay, he was a convert. He was not raised as a Christian. At some point, he converted, probably later in life, and he died ultimately in 395. But the main point to understand here is now we see this fusion, really, of Greco-Roman literary and political culture with members of the aristocracy that are now Christian. Okay, his students are oftentimes Christians, and they are becoming very influential. And very, both as ecclesiasts, as bishops, and also as military and civil leaders within the state. And his work, he has a very, very large body of work that has survived him. And his corpus shows that he was completely conversant with the entire span of classical literature. In particular, he wrote in a certain kind of genre that would become somewhat famous, not to say infamous, in the Middle Ages, known as the cento, which is where the word itself in Latin simply means quilt. But what a cento is in literature is a genre of literature in which a person makes a poem about some other topic than the one that he borrows from, and he makes it entirely out of lines taken from Virgil's Aeneid. It could potentially be from other poems as well, but that was the main one that was harvested, scavenged by writers of centos throughout the Middle Ages. It became a kind of it's a unique form of literature that only really existed in the Middle Ages, where one would take all these little lines or half lines from Virgil's Aeneid and make them into a pastiche that basically said something quite other than what the original one was saying. Okay, so we see this merger and this bequeathing of classical culture. And another perfect example of this same phenomenon is in the author Prudentius, Aurelius Prudentius Clemens, whose dates are roughly 348 to 413. So now we're in the next generation or so after Ausonius, although in some sense, just simply really a later contemporary. He was a Roman Christian poet, born in the Roman province of Tarraconensis, which was northern Spain. He probably died somewhere also in the Spanish Peninsula sometime after 405, as we say, probably around 413. The place of his birth is uncertain, but somewhere there in Spain. Prudentius practiced law with some success and was twice provincial governor, perhaps in his native country, before the Emperor Theodosius I summoned him to court. Towards the end of his life, possibly around 392, Prudentius retired from public life to become an ascetic, a monk essentially, fasting until evening and abstaining entirely from animal food. He wrote poems and hymns and works in defense of Christianity. As I say, the 4th century really was this battleground between paganism and Christianity, even though he died slightly after that in the early 5th century. Nevertheless, this religious balance within the Roman Empire, although it was already swaying very heavily in favor of Christianity, nevertheless was not, there were still plenty of pagans out there at this time. Really, at the end of the 4th century, the pagans had been humbled. They never really would rise up again. They would try to in the 390s and wage a kind of last-ditch, somewhat pathetic rebellion, which was mercilessly put down at the Battle of the Frigidus by Theodosius I. But I guess my point in mentioning all this is that he's sort of living through this critical period, this transitional period, and dies kind of just on the other side of it, although there still were plenty of pagans out there in Roman society. The poetry of Prudentius is both influenced by earlier Christian writers such as Tertullian and St. Ambrose of Milan, as well as, of course, by the Bible, and also the Acts of the Martyrs. These are accounts of the early martyrs of Rome. And some of his hymns are actually still in use today. However, his most influential work is the allegorical work, the Psychomachia, or Battle of the Souls, which incorporates elements of both Hellenic epic, Greek epic, and inner psychological conflict. It became the inspiration and wellspring of an entire very, very, very popular genre of literature in the Middle Ages, known as allegorical literature. Okay, these would be kind of like the morality plays, where an everyman figure encounters the figure of gluttony or sloth or wrath or lust or something like that, where works are allegorical for the Christian spiritual struggle. According to C.S. Lewis, who was, we think of him both as a Christian writer and, of course, as a wonderful writer of children's books, the Narnia Chronicles, and so on. But he was, in his own life, he was his main job, as it were, was as a professor of literature at Cambridge, and he was one of the major editors for the series of books known affectionately as "Oh Hell," the Oxford History of English Literature, OHEL. But anyway, C.S. Lewis famously kind of quipped one time about the Sukhamakia that it exceeded its intrinsic artistic merit by its influence. That is, it perhaps may not have been the greatest work of literature ever written, but nevertheless, it was supremely influential for later writers, as I said, within this medieval allegorical tradition. In the battle that he portrays between virtue and vice, full weight is given to the power of luxuria, luxury, but it kind of means more than that. It's sort of like, hedonism, something like that. Flower shod and swaying from the wine cup, every step a fragrance. That's how luxuria is described. With her attendants, beauty and pleasure, and her weapons of rose petals and violets, Luxuria succeeds in swaying the army of virtue in surrender to love before succumbing to ultimate defeat. You can kind of see it's, might be a little bit heavy-handed for modern tastes, but it was extremely influential. And the point really I'm trying to get at is that, again, we see this merger of Christianity with classical culture. That is, he's taking from older epic, from Greek epic even, and merging it obviously with biblical morality and spiritual Christian themes. Prudentius was one of the most popular medieval authors, and was read and studied. Even he wrote many works, but those, the ones that the Sukhamakia was definitely by far and away his most popular. And again, it is that in a further illustration of that those two central themes that I've been trying to outline so far for tonight, that we see this merger of classical and Christian literary culture, and also this bequeathing of the classical tradition into the Middle Ages. Okay, the next author that I would like to just kind of introduce you to, and this is really just a short survey of some of these authors that really kind of preserve the classical inheritance and transmit it to the next generation. You can, of course, feel free to, and I would encourage you deeply to look into all these authors yourself. These are authors who have, you could spend an entire career investigating these authors, and it would not be a waste of time at all. The next writer that I would like to talk about is the Saint Sidonius Apollinaris, who died late in the 5th century. Okay, so now again, we're moving now kind of in chronological order. He was a poet, a diplomat, and a bishop. Certainly the most important single surviving author from 5th century Gaul, but that doesn't do him really justice at all. He was one of 4 Gallo-Roman aristocrats of the 5th and into the 6th century, whose letters survive in real quantity. And he certainly was part of the tight aristocratic Gallo-Roman network that provided the bishops of Gaul for Gaul. And as I said, he is a saint. His feast day is on the 21st of August. And Sidonius was born at Lyon, that is the ancient city of Lugdunum. His father was prefect of Gaul under Valentinian III. Sidonius Apollinaris recalls with pride being present with his father at the installation of Asturias as consul for the year 449. So again, you see, like Ausonius, he's still very much a part of the political, the political scene, but which had become decidedly Christian by this point. Sidonius's grandfather was Praetorian prefect of Gaul sometime prior to 409, and a friend of his successor, Decimus Rusticus. Sidonius may be a descendant of another Apollinaris who was prefect of Gaul under Constantine II between 337 and 340. Sidonius married and to the daughter, actually, of the Emperor Avitus around 452. And he had a son from this and at least two daughters. Sidonius mentions in his letters a third daughter, but she's only mentioned, he mentions in his letters two daughters, Severina and Roscia. However, there is a third daughter that is mentioned, but only much later by St. Gregory of Tours. And one of the greatest Roman historians of the 19th century, Theodor Mommsen, a German, speculated that Alcima was this third daughter that is mentioned by Gregory of Tours. This may be another name for one of his other daughters. So we don't know how many daughters he had. We certainly know that he was very acquainted with the other bishops and of this area, and he had theological debates and even adversaries, and all of his life and friendships really put him at the center of both 5th century Roman affairs and ecclesiastical affairs. In 457, Majorian, that is the emperor, deprived Avitus of the empire and seized the city of Lyon. Sidonius fell into his hands. However, the reputation of Sidonius's learning led Majorian to treat him with the greatest of respect. And in return, Sidonius composed a panegyric in his honor, as he had done, incidentally, previously for Avitus. And this won him a statue at Rome and the title of comes, or kind of a companion to the emperor. This is one of those late Roman titles that would drift over into the Middle Ages as the term for a count. In 467 and 468, the emperor Anthemius rewarded him for the panegyric, which he had written in honor of him, by raising him to the post of urban prefect of Rome, which he held until 469, and afterwards he was raised to the dignity of patrician and senator. In 470 and 472, he was elected to succeed Eparchius in the bishopric of Averna. This is in the Clermont region. When the Goths captured Clermont in 474, he was imprisoned as he had taken an active part in its defense. But he was afterwards released from captivity by Euric, the king of the Goths, and continued to shepherd his flock as he had done before. And he did this until his death. Sidonius's relations have been traced over several generations as a narrative of a family's fortunes, from the prominence of his paternal grandfather's time into later decline in the 6th century under the Franks. And Sidonius' son Apollinaris, who was a correspondent of Ruricius of Limoges, commanded a unit raised in Auvergne on the losing side of the decisive Battle of Vuille, and also was bishop of Clermont for 4 months until he died. And Sidonius' grandson, Arcadius, when he had heard that the Frankish king Thuderic had died, betrayed Clermont to another Frankish king, Childebert, only to abandon his wife and mother when Thuderic appeared. His other appearance in the history of Gregory of Tours is as a servant of King Childebert. We know that Sidonius was still living in 481, but he was dead before 490 when his successor as bishop, Aprunculus, died. And his date of death, as I said, was 21st of August, which is his feast day. Now, his extant works are his panegyrics on different emperors, in which he draws largely upon Statius, Ausonius, and Claudian. These are all earlier Latin writers. And these panegyrics document several important political events. He also has a lot of poetry as well. One of his panegyrics is to his father-in-law, Avitus, on his inauguration as emperor, is particularly beautiful. Again, he also has this panegyric that I mentioned to Majorian, which offers evidence that Sidonius was able to overcome the sort of natural suspicion and hostility towards the man who was responsible for the death of his father-in-law. His panegyric to the emperor Anthemius was part of Sidonius's efforts to be appointed urban prefect of Rome. And several samples of his verse also survive. And 9 books of his letters also exist as well. The key point to take away again from all of this is the same two major themes that I've been hitting upon with each of these authors. We see that he incorporates the literary inheritance of pagan Rome into his own writings. He is a bishop, he is a saint, and yet he is completely learned and totally familiar with that classical inheritance. And he transmits it in his own active writing, taking an active part in the affairs of the late Roman Empire, and indeed the time in which Rome basically officially came to an end. We always use this date of 476 to describe the fall of the Roman Empire, and indeed many people who have never even studied the Roman Empire know that it fell. That's the one thing that they do know. A lot of scholarly ink has been spilled over this. Was it really a fall, or was it more of a transition into the Middle Ages? And certainly the answer to that question is that it was certainly a fall politically, but not, in the sense that there was no more Roman emperor around, and there was no more, all of the administration and all of the law courts and these all the things that the citizens of the empire looked to the central state to provide. Those things were no longer there now. However, culturally speaking, it was not really a fall, but much more of a transition. And that is really the best way to understand it. Even as these barbarian tribes conquered the Romans, they wanted to in some way lay claim to that mantle of being part of Rome. Rome really did mean civilization, even for the barbarians who destroyed it. And so we have to keep that in mind, and certainly figures like Sidonius Apollinaris are very much a part of that tradition. The next author that I would like to explore is Martianus Capella, whose dates are roughly 360 to 428. He was a Latin prose writer, one of the earliest developers, really, of the system of the seven liberal arts that structured so much of early medieval education. And we're going to be talking about that in a moment. His single encyclopedic work, De Nuptiis Philologiae et Mercurii, on the marriage of philology and Mercury, also called De Septem Disciplinis, or On the Seven Disciplines, is an elaborate didactic allegory written in a mixture of prose and elaborately elusive verse. Martianus often presents philosophical views based on Neoplatonism, that Platonic school of philosophy pioneered by Plotinus and his followers centuries earlier. Like his near contemporary Macrobius, who also produced a major work on classical Roman religion, Martianus never directly identifies his own religious affiliation, although it is most probably Christian. Much of his work occurs in the form of dialogue, and the views of the interlocutors certainly are not to be understood as representing necessarily the author's own perspectives at all times. Just about his life, Cassiodorus, a writer who we'll talk about at the end of our talk tonight, says that Martianus was a native of Madaura. This is in the Roman province of Africa, what is modern-day Algeria. He appears to have practiced as a jurist in Roman Carthage. Martianus was active during the 5th century, writing after the sack of Rome by Alaric the Goth in 410, which he mentions, he talks about it, but apparently he was active before the conquest of North Africa by the Vandals in the year 429. So he's roughly writing at the same time as St. Augustine, who, of course, we talked so much about last week. As early as the middle of the 6th century, professors of rhetoric such as Securus Memoir Felix received the text of his in Rome for his personal subscription at the end of Book 1, or Book 2 in many manuscripts, records that he was working, quote, from most corrupt exemplars, end quote. Now, some have erroneously taken this to mean that Martianus was himself active in the 6th century, and that gave rise to a long-standing misconception about Martianus's dating, but that's a whole other story. let me talk about this work, De Nuptiis Philologiae et Mercurii, or On the Seven Disciplines. It is an elaborate didactic allegory written in a mixture of prose and, as I said, elaborately elusive verse. And the style is wordy and involved, loaded with metaphor and sometimes bizarre expressions. The book was of great importance in defining the standard formula of academic learning from the Christianized Roman Empire of the 5th century until the Renaissance of the 13th century, of the 1300s, I should say. This formula included a medieval love for allegory, in particular personifications, as I mentioned before, with Prudentius. And these personifications as a means of presenting knowledge and a structuring of that learning around the 7 liberal arts. Just to repeat those before, so we have grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium, then geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Okay. Or harmony, as it's often called. These together, these are the 7 liberal arts, the 7 studies that are worthy of an education of a free man, which is what and which in some ways make a person a truly free man. That is the etymology of why they're called the artes liberales. The book, embracing in kind of summary the narrowed classical culture of its time, was dedicated to his son. Its frame story in the first 2 books relates the courtship and wedding of Mercury, who's kind of sort of an allegory himself of intelligence and profitable pursuits, who had been refused by wisdom, along with the maiden Philologia, meaning more kind of learning, or more literally the love of letters and of study, who is made immortal under the protection of the gods. The muses, of course, are representative of the cardinal virtues and the graces. This title refers to the allegorical union of the intellectually profitable pursuit, Mercury, and learning by way of the arts of letters. So is this kind of one of the things that we've talked so much about in our course together is this idea of the usefulness versus the uselessness of education. That is, that education is not meant to be something that is pursued for the sake of mercenary gain, but rather it is something that is a transformative experience within a person, and that it is a good in and of itself, regardless of whether or not it helps you make money. And that's not a position that everybody would automatically be attracted to, but at least it was understood in ancient times as being the case, whereas now I would say in our culture it is really the whole idea of what education is really even supposed to be about has been lost on so many people, and is really is mistaken and so adulterated. But there is this idea, though, of the kind of marriage between profitable pursuits, Mercury, right, the god of merchandise, that's where the word merchandise comes from, and the liberal arts represented by philology. Among the wedding gifts that are made are 7 maids who will be philology's servants. They are the 7 liberal arts. Grammar is an old woman with a knife for excising children's grammatical errors. Dialectic or logic, and of course rhetoric, who is a tall woman with a dress decorated with figures of speech and armed in a fashion to harm adversaries. And then there are the other 4, the quadrivium: geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. As each art is introduced, philology gives an exposition of the principles of the science that is represented by these figures, thereby providing a summary of the 7 liberal arts. 2 other arts, architecture and medicine, were present at the feast, but since they care for earthly things, they were to keep silent in the company of the celestial deities. Again, a clear indication of this age-old idea that the education is not meant to be something that gets you money, that has earthly pursuits in some ways. It is meant to be something of another character altogether. Well, each book in this work is an abstract or a compilation from earlier authors. The treatment of the subjects belongs to a tradition which goes all the way back to the time of Varro, the Roman author of the 1st century BC, in his work, the Disciplinae. Even to Varro's passing allusion to architecture and medicine as being, kind of things that care for that are earthly, that are educational, but are ultimately for a practical end. These in Martianus Capella's day were kind of mechanics arts, material for clever slaves, but not for educated people, not for senators and aristocrats. The classical Roman curriculum, which was to pass largely through Martianus's book into the early medieval period, was modified but scarcely revolutionized by Christianity. This is really such an important point to make, that through these authors, particularly Martianus Capella and Cassiodorus, who we're going to meet in a moment, but the other ones too that I've been talking about so far tonight, these were sort of the authors that, by which the classical curriculum was transitioned over into the Christian Middle Ages. The 8th book describes a modified geocentric astronomical model in which the Earth is at rest in the center of the universe, encircled by the moon, the sun, 3 planets, and the stars, while Mercury and Venus circle the sun. And this view was actually singled out for praise by Copernicus in book 1 of his De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium. But that's a whole other story. Martianus Capella can best be understood in terms of the reputation of his book. The work was read, taught, and commented upon throughout the early Middle Ages, and it shaped European education during the early medieval period, and especially during the period of time known as the Carolingian Renaissance, initiated by Charlemagne. As early as the end of the 5th century, another North African, one Fulgentius, composed a work modeled on it, and this was, and in general, this text was vastly influential throughout subsequent Middle Ages. Martianus played a major role as a transmitter of ancient learning until the rise of a kind of new system of learning founded on scholastic Aristotelianism kind of took its place in the 13th century. But even then, Martianus was still credited as having been the efficient cause of the study of astronomy. Of course, modern interpreters have had less interest in Martianus's ideas, except for maybe the light that his work throws on what men in other times and places knew or thought it was important to know about the liberal arts. But really, for us to the best thing for us is to understand that Martianus Capella, it represents this kind of conduit by which classical learning, ancient wisdom, was conveyed over to the Middle Ages. And again, we see this merger of Christianity and classical culture, and this bequeathing to subsequent generations of that body of learning. The next author that I would like to look upon briefly is Priscian, or Priscianus Caesarianus, who flourished around the year 500, commonly referred to simply in English as Priscian. He was a Latin grammarian and the author of what is known in English as the Institutes of Grammar, which was the standard textbook for the study of Latin during the Middle Ages. It also provided the raw material for the field of what is known as speculative grammar. The detail of Priscian's life, details are largely unknown. Priscian was born and raised in the North African city of Caesarea, which is in Algeria, the capital of the Roman province of Mauritania Caesariensis, which during his lifetime would have been under the control of the Vandal kingdom, a group of these Germanic barbarians who were wreaking havoc all over the former Western Roman Empire. According to a later writer who we will look at tonight, Cassiodorus, Priscian taught Latin at Constantinople in the early 6th century. His minor works include a panegyric to Anastasius, the emperor, written about 512, which helps establish this time period. In addition, the manuscripts of his institutes contain a subscription, a writing underneath them, to the effect that the work was copied by Flavius Theodorus, who was a clerk in the imperial secretariat. Now, this, as I keep mentioning the Institutes, this was certainly his most famous work, the Institutiones Grammaticae, and it is a systematic exposition of Latin grammar. It is dedicated to Julian, and this probably indicates the consul and patrician, not the well-known epitome of Justinian's novellae, who lived somewhat later than Priscian. Certainly it is not Julian the Apostate, who reigned during the middle of the 4th century. His grammar is divided into 18 books, of which the first 16 deal mainly with sounds, word formation, and inflections. The last 2, which form from a 4th to a 3rd of the whole work, deal with syntax. Priscian's grammar is based on the earlier works of Herodian and Apollonius. The examples it includes to illustrate the rules of Latin preserve numerous fragments from Latin authors which would have otherwise been lost, including such classical authors as Ennius, Pacuvius, Accius, Lucilius, Cato the Elder, and Varro. But the authors whom he quotes most of all are Virgil, and next to him Terence, Cicero, Plautus, and Lucan, Horace, Juvenal, Sallust, Statius, Ovid, Livy, and Persius. So the full panoply of classical authors. The grammar was quoted by many writers in Britain, starting in the 8th century, such as Venerable Bede, Aldhelm, Alcuin, and was abridged or largely used in the next century by Rabanus of Maurus and Fulda, these later medieval writers. Something like 1,000 manuscripts exist of his Institutiones Grammaticae, which shows you something of the popularity of the work. He also has other minor works, which we don't need to go into. But just to kind of drive the point home, the Institutes, particularly books 17 and 18, one of his other works on construction, all formed part of the core curriculum of of medieval education, particularly even as late as the University of Paris in the 13th century. All derive their core curriculum from his for Latin from his works, from his universal grammar. Now, it is perhaps otiose to keep repeating the same point, but we can see just so much of the same idea of kind of subsuming the classical tradition and the curriculum and passing it over to the Middle Ages and then onward. And of course, Priscian, of course, was a Christian as well. Now, the next author that I want to talk about, and I'm going to kind of take a different tack on this one, is the author Boethius. For nearly a millennium, Boethius's work, The Consolation of Philosophy, was a bestseller throughout Europe. It was read not only by those who could understand its 6th century Latin original, but also those who studied it in any of a multiplicity of translations into Old and Middle English, Old French, Old High German, Italian, Spanish, and many other languages, including Greek and Hebrew. Although Aristotle's texts shaped the university curriculum and Augustine's thought was ubiquitous, in the period from, say, 800 AD until about 1600 AD, no other philosophical text could compete with the Consolation in its appeal, that is, the work of Boethius. Not just to the intellectual elite either, but to a much wider audience as well, which is really remarkable. Now the work is the preserve of scholarly medievalists. It's not read by the general public as much, although that is a great shame. In my opinion, it is one of the books that every person should read, right up there with St. Augustine's Confessions, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy is really such a profound and life-changing text. Unlike, say, Plato's Dialogues, for instance, or René Descartes' Meditations, Boethius's text no longer seems to carry a broad philosophical appeal for many readers. But I am going to argue, if read carefully in its historical and literary context, it should do this. The Consolation is a far more subtle work than it at first seems to be. While the medieval audience, for the most part, responded to its more obvious features, its hidden complexities and subtleties are what can open its appeal, I think, for modern readers now. The Consolation is the product of the dramatic circumstances that ended its author's life. And I'm just going to kind of sketch for you some of the details about Boethius's life right now, because they both are reflective of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West and the subsequent kind of barbarian kingdoms that sprung up in the wake of the Roman Empire in the West. And they also reflect kind of this these two broader themes that I've been talking about so much tonight, of merging Christianity and classical culture and passing it along to the subsequent generations. Boethius was born around 476, the very year that the Western Roman Empire fell. And he belonged to a rich, prestigious Roman family. He lived most of his life enjoying the privileges of his class, participating in the ceremonies of the Senate, writing works and commentaries on mathematics, music, logic, all with the help of his education in Greek culture. And he knew the Greek language fluently. And as I said before, it was actually his translation of the 6 works of Aristotle that are collectively referred to as the Organon, or his logical works, that by which the Middle Ages had any knowledge whatsoever of Aristotle up until the Arabs brought it over in the High Middle Ages. But his birth had coincided with the beginning of what is known as Ostrogothic rule in Italy. You see, the Ostrogoths had sacked Rome and had toppled the Roman Empire, had basically forced the last emperor, who was simply a boy named Romulus Augustulus, to abdicate. And they had installed one of their own, Odoacer, as a king, not as a new emperor, but simply as a king of a new Gothic kingdom on the soil of Italy. And in subsequent years, Theodoric, the Gothic king, wanted good relations with the native Roman aristocrats, but they remained a threat to him. And in the early 520s, so now we're just really one generation now after the fall of Rome, this Theodoric the Great, as he's oftentimes called, simply Theodoric, invited Boethius to become the Magister Officiorum, master of offices, which was kind of basically the most important official within the cabinet, as it were, of the king, within the court of the king. And Boethius accepted this position, but his determination to root out corruption soon made him enemies. And Theodoric was willing to believe that Boethius was plotting against him. He was falsely accused by a couple of other Goths who were obviously, had some kind of ethnic rivalry or some kind of suspicion or whatever, cultural friction with the Roman Boethius. And they denounced him as plotting against the king. And Boethius was found guilty of treason and other charges. He was imprisoned. And he sat there awaiting execution. And it was at this moment, when he's imprisoned on false charges, awaiting execution, that he wrote his Consolation of Philosophy, with his own circumstances as a condemned prisoner providing the setting for the work. The work is a dialogue between Boethius the prisoner and the personification. There's that typical medieval kind of trope there, this personification of philosophy in the shape of a beautiful woman who appears to him in his cell. And on the picture on the screen, you can see there's Lady Philosophy standing next to Boethius as he's laying in bed ailing. The discussion is in prose, but is interspersed with poems that summarize, comment upon, take forward, or provide otherwise another perspective to the main line of argument that is put forward in the prose. Again, we've seen this in some of the other writers that we've talked about tonight, this combination, this going back and forth of prose and poetry. Well, at the beginning of the text, Boethius the prisoner can do nothing but lament his sudden fall from prosperity and explain at length to philosophy the injustice of the charges against him. Philosophy is not at all sympathetic, though. She tells him that if he had remembered her teachings, he wouldn't be complaining as he does, that God has no concern for humans, and that the good suffer and the wicked prosper. She sets out to answer both of these charges. In its obvious outlines, her argument has this shape. Like a doctor, philosophy begins with gentle remedies, and then when her patient is ready for them, uses stronger medicine. She begins by arguing that the prisoner shouldn't blame fortune for taking away the gifts she had happened to give him before, and that anyway, these good things of fortune are not really true goods at all. Things like wealth, health, social position, privilege, and all of that kind of stuff. The wheel of fortune turns ineluctably. You can't wrestle against it. No one can expect to be forever at the top, enjoying the best that life has to offer. Gradually, Lady Philosophy leads the prisoner to see that all goodness comes from one source, the highest good, which is identified with God. Only by adhering to this good can a person become truly happy. Following the line of argument in Plato's dialogue, The Gorgias, she goes on to explain that by acting well, we achieve what we wish and make ourselves happy, and that we make ourselves miserable when we are wicked. The good are not, therefore, truly oppressed, nor do the wicked prosper genuinely. God does indeed care for humanity. He has set himself as an end, and by striving to reach him, they can gain happiness. But God also, she adds, exercises a providential control over human beings, although his purposes in doing so are often hidden from us. Well, Boethius, the prisoner, at this point responds by raising a logical problem. If God foresees all future events, as the account of his providence implies, how can any events be contingent? That is, how can they at all rely upon the free will of the actors who make them? If they are not, that is, if everything takes place simply because it must take place, then Boethius says there will be no moral responsibility for acting well or badly, right? Your computer doesn't act well or badly when it does what you program it to do. So if human beings are simply kind of by force doing the things that God has programmed them to do by his irresistible will, then where is the moral responsibility for either acting well or acting badly? If everything is already fixed, there is no room for choice. Well, Lady Philosophy answers with a complex argument. And this is where I want to kind of spend some time thinking about, kind of giving you something to think about in terms you can see just how remarkable of a thinker Boethius was. Using the idea that God exists in an eternity not measured by time, Lady Philosophy claims that future events can at once be contingent and yet known as necessary by God. Okay, they can be both contingent upon the human actors that make them, and yet at the same time known as necessary by God. The most striking feature of this whole discussion is not anything said, however, but an absence, something that is not said. Boethius, of course, is a Christian facing death, but there is nothing in the constellation that is specifically Christian. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist mathematician who wrote a history of philosophy, he makes this point almost with a kind of gleefulness, because he's very happy to, he obviously respects the intelligence of Boethius and sees him as an astounding person for his day, so cultured and so educated and so wanting to pass that education down to the next generation, that he undertakes so much labor of translation and so on. And even though he is a Christian, he never actually mentions the name of Christ anywhere inside of the dialogue, inside of the text of the Constellation of Philosophy. And philosophy, as a personification in this text, represents and sticks strictly to the tradition of pagan philosophy, which went back to Plato and Aristotle, and the Stoics, and earlier than them too, and which was still which was actually still being practiced in Boethius's day at the Platonic schools of Athens and Alexandria, although it would come to be shut down relatively soon afterwards by Justinian. He would ultimately close the schools of philosophy in Athens and Alexandria, but that's besides the point. the point is that lady philosophy still kind of speaks in terms that would be completely germane and completely unoffensive to any pagan philosopher. And the prisoner doesn't stray outside of her perspective. The medieval readers of the Consolation noticed this feature, but for the most part, they didn't let it complicate their understanding of the text. And I might also add that because Boethius was part of the Universal Church, part of the Catholic Church, and Theodoric was an Arian Christian, that is a heretical Christian. Ultimately, when Boethius was executed, his subsequent Nachleben, his reputation in subsequent ages, kind of took on the quality of something of like a martyr for the faith. Even though that, strictly speaking, was not actually the reason why he was killed. He was not killed because of his orthodoxy, but rather because of this false accusation. But nevertheless, the fact that Theodoric was a heretical Christian and Boethius was not, gave room for that sort of kind of tradition or traditional way of thinking about Boethius. Now, thinkers of the time in the early Middle Ages always had the tendency to assimilate the deity of Aristotle and the ancient Platonists with the God of Christianity. This is something we've talked about before. Aristotle and Plato talk about God in the singular quite a lot. Certainly the Stoics did. And so for these early Roman Christians and for Christians of the Middle Ages who were reading these classical texts, which we saw they were doing a lot of, there was a general tendency to very effortlessly just simply kind of identify the God that Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics and so on are talking about with the God of Christianity. Some readers of the Consolations, such as its earliest editors in the years after Boethius's death, and Alcuin at the turn of the 9th century in Britain, they gave it an explicitly biblical character by identifying philosophy, the lady philosophy, with the figure of wisdom taken from King Solomon's book of Proverbs, right, chapter 8, where wisdom is personified. Most readers were content simply to take its teaching as unproblematically compatible with Christianity, though not maybe overtly Christian. To them, the cultural world of the Consolations seemed misleadingly familiar, and they attributed to its author an easy accommodation between ancient philosophy and Christian belief, possible at their distance from antiquity, although not in Boethius's own more conflicted times, right? He's still living in a time when there were still pagans out there, and indeed heretical Christians too. There were exceptions. One writer, Bovo, in the 10th century, who was an abbot of Corvey, denounced the pagan teaching in the work. More subtly, late in the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer, the great writer in Middle English, employed the Consolation, which he clearly loved and actually translated into Middle English. He employed it as a source for how distinctively pagan characters, such as Theseus in The Knight's Tale and Troilus and Cressida, use or more frequently abuse philosophy. Chaucer seems to have been one of the rare writers of his time to notice that Boethius was making an important point, though, by choosing the pagan figure of philosophy as his figure of authority. To readers now, who are under no illusion of cultural familiarity and with the benefit of modern scholarship, the significance of this choice, I think, should be obvious. Because we know that to Boethius and his envisioned contemporary readers, pagan philosophy was still a reality. And although all Christians, that is, all of his audience were Christians, nevertheless, they were also self-consciously guardians of the ancient pre-Christian tradition of learning, of law, and of civility. For them, the choice of a figure representing pagan philosophy as the authoritative speaker who sets the parameters of discussion for the Christian prisoner would have molded how the Consolation was to be understood. It would have been seen as a work about the relationship between the tradition of ancient philosophy and Christian faith, and more challengingly, as one that, like Plato's dialogues on Socrates' trial and execution, asks, how can someone give meaning to life in the face of rapidly approaching death? with the help of philosophical training, but without the obvious consolation of Christian religious belief. This question is one that still troubles modern readers. Believers and not perhaps believers and certainly non-believers seek answers about how to live in relation to our mortality. But the way in which Boethius, the author, answers these has a complexity and a many-sidedness that brings his work, The Consolation of Philosophy, even closer to today's contemporary readers than I think it did to his own contemporaries. Because on a straightforward reading of The Consolation, philosophy's argument is taken as authoritative and is accepted by both Boethius, the prisoner, and by the author. If so, The Consolation, like Plato's dialogues on Socrates' execution, is a bold assertion of the power of unaided human reason, even in the face of death. But, and the same objection might even be made to Plato's Phaedo, the central philosophical arguments are likely to seem too weak, especially to modern readers, to support such a claim. There is, however, reason to think that this straightforward reading doesn't do The Consolation justice. Ancient readers were very conscious of a work's genre. It guided their expectations of how its author intended it to be understood. By writing The Consolation in alternating prose and verse, Boethius signaled that the work is something like a Menippean satire. And as Joel Relihan showed in his work in Ancient Menippean Satire, published in 1993, this genre of satire ridicules figures of authority. Readers of The Consolation might therefore expect philosophy's teachings not to be treated with complete respect. From this starting point, Relihan develops in The Prisoner's Philosophy, published in 2007, a reading that is diametrically opposed to the straightforward one. Philosophy, he argues, is shown as failing to provide the prisoner with consolation, and this failure was Boethius's way of revealing the weakness of any sort of human reasoning. The implicit message is that Christian faith alone provides the type of consolation that Boethius, the prisoner, was wrongly seeking from philosophy. Such a reading treats all The Consolation's philosophical argumentation as if it were mere rhetoric, devised by Boethius, the author, just in order to show its inadequacy, with its main message delivered by indirect means. Now, that's a very ingenious argument. It's difficult to accept, though. Would Boethius, who had devoted his life to philosophy, really have treated arguments in this way? Why, for instance, in particular, why elaborate the intricate argument at the end of the work about divine prescience and contingency? Certainly, this is his most fine and most original piece of reasoning, if his purpose were simply to show the inadequacy of philosophy and not its power to console. Although it raises important questions, Relihan's reading is, therefore, for me at least, ultimately unpersuasive. A more plausible view is that Boethius, the author, did in fact intend philosophy's arguments to be taken seriously and tried his very best to put well-constructed reasonings into the character's mouth. At the same time, however, he wanted to indicate that such arguing fell short of uncovering the whole truth, and he did so by leaving tensions within the argumentative structure of The Consolation as a whole. There are three, in fact, main interlinked areas of tension. One, about human happiness. Two, about providence and the suffering of the good. And three, about human freedom. I'm going to go over each one of these in turn. Over a long stretch of The Consolation, not just during the time that Lady Philosophy is putting forward her initial easier remedies, she develops a complex view of human happiness. She dismisses, for instance, the value of many of the goods of fortune, which are what most people seek: riches, high office, kingdoms, public praise, and even sensual pleasures. She sees the pursuit of any of these as a misguided attempt to gain the true goods of sufficiency, respect, power, enduring fame, and joy. Having these true goods, which can't be taken away from someone in the prisoner's position, is central to happiness. But some goods of fortune, such as the people one loves, are also accepted as being genuinely valuable. However, from the middle of the work onwards, philosophy proposes a very different view of happiness. It is gained, she argues, not through having a complex set of goods, but through the supreme good, which is presented monolithically and identified with God. Any of the individual goods people usually value are worthless in themselves and distract from the pursuit of the true good, which is God. The explanation, based on the Gorgias, as I've said, and the account there of why the good don't suffer and the wicked fail to prosper, fits well with this approach, because according to it, God doesn't intervene in the course of events or arrange them. Rather, by adhering to God, the supreme good, as their end, people can gain happiness. And by turning away from him in a wicked life, they punish themselves, and even, as philosophy insists, are in danger of ceasing to exist at all. But here, Boethius, the prisoner, who so far has willingly accepted the whole train of philosophy's reasoning, comes forward to object to the massively counterintuitive consequences of her position. Which wise person, the prisoner asks, would prefer to be a penniless, disgraced exile rather than stay in their own city and lead their flourishing life, mighty in wealth, revered in honor, and strong in power? Now, although Lady Philosophy could easily have replied by asserting her position and blaming the prisoner for missing her point, she chooses to abandon her previous arguments and, as I've already mentioned, she develops a different account of divine providence. According to this, the entire course of history has been arranged by God's reason to preserve goodness and eliminate wickedness. When evil people apparently prosper, there is a divine purpose in it, perhaps to help them repent, perhaps to use the harm they inflict on others as punishments for those who deserve it, or as a trial to make the good even better. Lady Philosophy takes exception to human free will from the control of the providence she describes here. And this is why the next and final objection made by Boethius the prisoner, that is, divine prescience is incompatible with future contingency. This is what makes it so important. God's perfection requires that he be omniscient. Therefore, he knows not just what has happened and is happening, but what is going to happen, including the future movements of my will or anyone's will. But if God knows how I'm going to will tomorrow, for example, that I'm going to will to have a cup of coffee when I wake up, then it seems that I am not free to will the opposite. This is why the threat to contingency posed by divine prescience is so serious. It strikes at the freedom of the will, and so, at least on Boethius's view, shared by many philosophers, freedom of the will is the basis for moral responsibility. Philosophy gives an elaborate answer, though, to this problem, which deals with the objections that Boethius the prisoner has made to various such solutions. Yet even in her answer, if her answer is successful, Lady Philosophy faces a further, deeper difficulty. Boethius, the prisoner, comments parenthetically, and Lady Philosophy accepts it, that God's knowledge is unlike ours in a very important way. When we know that something is the case, it is the case independently of our belief. It is because our belief correctly tracks how things are that it is a candidate for being knowledge. However, with respect to God, whatever is the case because he knows it is the case. God's knowledge doesn't track reality, but rather it brings about how things are. If so, then even if the objection about divine prescience can be solved, it will remain that given God knows our wills, God and not we brings about how we will. Very near to the end of the consolation, philosophy claims that her solution to the problem of prescience solves this problem too. But what she offers is an assertion and not an argument. She says, quote, "This power of knowledge, wrapping together all things in a present act of knowledge, itself sets the measure for all things, and owes nothing to things inferior to it." Perhaps Boethius, the author, was unaware of these tensions in the argumentative structure of the Consolation. Given his impending execution, he might not have had the time to reflect on or revise his work carefully. But especially given his choice of genre, where authority is questioned, it is more likely that they are deliberate, I think, and that they are designed to show that philosophy can indeed console even the condemned Christian Boethius, but only to a certain extent. Purely rational human speculation can grasp a good deal, but it cannot achieve a full coherent understanding of how the different elements in the divinely ordered universe fit together. Implicitly, then, the narrative of the author, Boethius, is designed to make the prisoner step beyond a purely philosophical consolation. But this move is presented not as a rejection of philosophy, but as a completion of it. And it is foreshadowed in pagan terms by Lady Philosophy herself, who refers more than once to her own inadequacy as teacher. This reading is supported by a feature in the discussion about divine prescience that is often overlooked. From the discussion between the prisoner and philosophy, the following emerges as the kernel of the problem. Future contingent events are by their very nature uncertain and unfixed, but only what is fixed and certain can be known. Even if God is always right in predicting future events, his claim to know them must therefore be false. Philosophy attacks, though, this conclusion by asserting a very surprising principle. She says, quote, "Everything that is known is grasped not according to its own power, but rather according to the capacity of those who know it," end quote. As used in the discussion that follows, this is a principle that relativizes knowledge to knowers according to their cognitive capacities. Our bodily senses, our reasons, and God's intellect grasp a given object in different ways and reach different truths, which would be incompatible unless relativized. A human being is an individual, as grasped by the senses, but a universal, as grasped by reason. The choice that I make using my free will tomorrow with my coffee is a contingent event from my and other humans' perspective, but a necessary one as seen from the grandstand view of God in eternity. Unlike most relativisms today, Boethius's relativism is hierarchical. Reason grasps reality better than the senses, and divine intellect grasps it better than reason. Such hierarchical relativism demands from humans an attitude of epistemic humility. We should be diffident about our powers to attain knowledge of the truth. However much we might esteem human reason, we should also realize that by its very nature it is limited, and that the ultimate explanation of the universe is open only to a cognitive power superior to our own. Medieval readings of Boethius's consolation tended to smooth over, the forcefulness of its message by making its arguments harmonize, perhaps too facilely, with the Christian culture that the people of the time shared with its author. Readers today, though, have a distance from the work that enables them to read it more precisely in the context of Boethius's own times, and to discover how much Boethius's way of thinking has indeed with the modern perspective. We can see the consolation both as a bold defense of human reason in the face of injustice and impending violent death, but also as an uncovering of reason's inadequacy. Boethius, the prisoner, receives some consolation from philosophy, but more instruction. And perhaps the most important lesson that he learns is the one about epistemic humility. And with that, I would commend to you the reading of Boethius's text. If you can, it is a marvelous work and one that repays frequent study. Okay. The last author that I would like to now turn to for our discussion tonight is Cassiodorus, or Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, Senator, whose dates are roughly 485 to 585. He was a Roman statesman, a renowned scholar of antiquity, and a writer serving the same administration of Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, who had Boethius put to death. Incidentally, Senator was actually part of his surname, so not his rank. He was not a senator. Most importantly, though, for us, is that he founded the monastery, the Vivarium, where he spent the last years of his life, and it is there that he had school, and in which he was one of the main conduits that the classical tradition was given over to the Middle Ages. Some historians speculate that his family was of Syrian origin, based on his Greek name. His ancestry included some of the most prominent ministers of the state, extending back to several generations. His great-grandfather held a command in the defense of the coasts of southern Italy from Vandal sea raids in the middle of the 5th century. His grandfather appears in a Roman embassy to Attila the Hun, notice, in the middle of the 5th century. And his father, who bore the same name, served as Count of the Sacred Largesse and Count of the Private Estates of Odoacer, that Ostrogothic king who deposed the last Roman emperor. And then his father ultimately transferred his allegiance over to Theodoric when he assumed the throne, and under whom he rose to an even higher position, that of Praetorian Prefect, which he held under the Gothic kings, with the same influence that it had previously had in the court of Rome. So you see this great transition from the Western Roman Empire into the small little kingdoms that characterized the Middle Ages. Cassiodorus began his career under the auspices of his father about the age of 20, when his father made him the consularius upon his own appointment to the Praetorian prefecture. In the judicial capacity of the prefect, he held absolute right of appeal over any magistrate in the empire or Gothic kingdom later. And the consularius served, and as consularius, he served as a sort of legal advisor in cases of greater complexity. Evidently, therefore, Cassiodorus had received some education in the law prior to this. During his working life, he worked as quaestor sacri palatii, that would be something like inspector of the royal archives, and as consul in 514, and then as magister officiorum, that is the same position that Boethius had held under Theodoric. And he would ultimately have, Cassiodorus, that is, would ultimately have it again under Theodoric's young successor, Athalaric. Cassiodorus kept copious records and letter books concerning public affairs. And at the Gothic court, his literary skill, which seems mannered and rhetorical to modern readers, was so esteemed that when in Ravenna, he was often entrusted with drafting significant public documents. His culminating appointment was as Praetorian Prefect in Italy, effectively the prime minister of the Ostrogothic civil government, and a high honor to finish any career. Cassiodorus also collaborated with Pope Agapetus in establishing a library of Greek and Latin texts, which were intended to support a Christian school in Rome. So you can see his interest in education was marked even earlier on in his career. The scholar James O'Donnell gives the following quotation. It is almost indisputable that Cassiodorus accepted advancement in 523 as the immediate successor of Boethius, who was then falling from grace after less than a year as magister officiorum, and who was sent to prison and later executed. In addition, Boethius's father-in-law and stepfather, Symmachus, by this time a distinguished elder statesman, followed Boethius to the block within a year. All this was a result of the worsening split between the ancient senatorial aristocracy centered in Rome and the adherents of Gothic rule at Ravenna. But to read Cassiodorus's Varii, one would never suspect such goings on. You see, he kind of, as a true intellectual, took refuge from the world in his studies. There is no mention, incidentally, in Cassiodorus's selection of official correspondences on the death of Boethius, which is interesting. Well, Athalaric died in early 534, and the remainder of Cassiodorus's public career was dominated by the Byzantine reconquest and dynastic intrigue among the Ostrogoths. That is, this is when Emperor Justinian tried to, and indeed did, somewhat briefly reconquer the West for Rome and bring it back and reuniting the Roman Empire. Cassiodorus's last letters were drafted in the name of Vitiges, That is, what must have been one of the officials that he was working for. Around 537 to 538, he left Italy for Constantinople, from where his successor was appointed, and where he remained for almost 2 decades, concentrating on religious questions. He notably met Junius, the quaestor of Justinian there, and his journey to Constantinople contributed to the improvement of his religious knowledge. Cassiodorus spent his career trying to bridge the 6th century cultural divides that existed between East and West, between Greek culture and Latin culture, between Roman and Goth, and between Orthodox Christians and their Arian heretical rulers. He speaks fondly in his Institutiones of Dionysius Exiguus, the church father who calculated the years Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. And in his retirement, Cassiodorus founded the monastery of Vivarium on his family estates on the shores of the Ionian Sea in Calabria, and his writings there turned to religion. Cassiodorus's Vivarium, or monastery school, was composed of 2 main buildings, a Cenobitic monastery and a retreat for those who desired a more solitary life. Both were located on the site of the modern Santa Maria de Vetere near Squillace. The twin structure of Vivarium was to permit Cenobitic monks and hermits to coexist together. The Vivarium appears not to have been governed by any strict monastic rule, such as that of the Order of St. Benedict. Rather, Cassiodorus's work, the Institutiones, was written to guide the monks' studies. And to this end, the Institutiones focused largely on texts assumed to have been available in the Vivarium's library. The Institutiones seem to have been composed over a lengthy period of time, from the 530s into the 550s, with redactions up to the time of Cassiodorus's death. Cassiodorus composed the Institutiones as a guide for introductory learning of both divine and secular writings, in place of his formerly planned Christian school in Rome. He says this at the beginning of his work: "I was moved by divine love to devise for you, with God's help, these introductory books to take the place of a teacher. Through them, I believe that both the textual sequence of Holy Scripture and also a compact account of secular letters may, with God's grace, be revealed." The first section of the Institutiones deals with Christian texts and was intended to be used in combination with his Expositio Psalmorum, his commentary on the Psalms. The order of subjects in the second book of the Institutiones reflected what would become the trivium and quadrivium of medieval liberal arts: the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. And while he encouraged study of secular subjects, Cassiodorus clearly considered them useful primarily as aids to the study of divinity, much in the same manner that we talked about with St. Augustine. Cassiodorus's Institutiones thus attempted to provide what Cassiodorus saw as a well-rounded education necessary for a learned Christian, all in uno corpore, as Cassiodorus put it, all in one body. The library, and this is classical Christian education. Right? This is the ideal of it as it would be transmitted to the Middle Ages for centuries and centuries afterwards. The library at the Vivarium was still active in 630 when the monks brought the relics of Saint Agathias from Constantinople there, dedicating to him a spring-fed fountain shrine that still exists, actually. However, its books were later dispersed, the Codex Grandior of the Bible being purchased by the Anglo-Saxon Kilfrith when he was in Italy around 680, and taken by him to Wearmouth Yarrow, where it served as the source for the copying of the Codex Amiatinus, which was then brought back to Italy by the now aged Kilfrith. Despite the demise of the Vivarium, Cassiodorus's work in compiling classical sources and presenting a sort of bibliography of resources would prove extremely influential in late antique Western Europe. And I'll just I'd like to give you a few words about his educational philosophy. Cassiodorus devoted much of his life to supporting education within the Christian community at large. When his proposed theological university in Rome was denied, he was forced to re-examine his entire approach to how material was learned and interpreted. His work, the Varii, showed that Like Augustine, Cassiodorus viewed reading as a transformative act for the reader, and it is with this in mind that he designed and mandated the course of studies at the Vivarium, which demanded an intense regimen of reading and meditation. By assigning a specific order of text to be read, Cassiodorus hoped to create the discipline necessary within the reader to become a successful monk. The first work in his succession of texts would, of course, be the Psalms, with which the untrained reader would need to begin because of its appeal to emotion and temporal goods. By examining the rate at which copies of his psalmic commentaries were issued, it is fair to assess that as the first work in his series, Cassiodorus's educational agenda had been implemented to some degree of success. Beyond demanding the pursuit of discipline among his students, Cassiodorus encouraged the study of the liberal arts. He believed these arts were part of the content of the Bible, and some mastery of them, especially grammar and rhetoric, were necessary for a complete understanding of the Bible. And these arts, as I say, were divided into the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and this would have included idioms, vocabulary, etymology, and so on. And then, of course, the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He also encouraged the Benedictine monks to study the medical texts of that era, the known herbals and texts of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen. Cassiodorus is rivaled only by Boethius in his drive to preserve and explore classical literature during the 6th century. He found the writings of the Greeks and Romans valuable for their expression of higher truths where other arts had failed. Though he saw these texts as vastly inferior to the perfect word of Scripture, the truths presented in them played to Cassiodorus's educational principles. Thus, he is unafraid to cite, say, Cicero alongside Scripture, and to acknowledge the classical ideal of good being part of the practice of rhetoric. His love for classical thought also influenced his administration of the Vivarium. Cassiodorus connected deeply with Christian Neoplatonism, which saw beauty as concomitant with the good. This inspired him to adjust his educational program to support the aesthetic enhancement of manuscripts within the monastery, something which had been practiced before, but not in the universality that he suggested. Classical learning would by no means replace the role of Scripture within the monastery. It was intended to augment the education already underway. And it is also worth noting that all Greek and Roman works were heavily screened to ensure only proper exposure to texts, fitting with the rest of the structured learning. Cassiodorus's legacy is profound. Before the founding of the Vivarium, the copying of manuscripts had been a task reserved for either inexperienced or physically infirm monks, and was performed at the whim of, basically unsystematically. Through the influence of Cassiodorus, however, the monastic system adopted a more vigorous, widespread, and regularized approach to reproducing documents within the monastery. This approach to the development of the monastic lifestyle was perpetuated especially through German religious institutions. This change in daily life also became associated with a higher purpose. The process was not merely associated with disciplinary habit of writing things down silently, but also with the preservation of history, literature, philosophy, and culture. During Cassiodorus's lifetime, theological study was, as with so much of culture, on the decline, and classical writings were disappearing. Even as the victorious Ostrogoth armies remained in the countryside, they continued to pillage and destroy Christian holy places in Italy. Cassiodorus's program, therefore, helped ensure that both classical and Christian literature were preserved throughout the Middle Ages. During his contributions to monastic order, literature, and education, throughout all of this, however, Cassiodorus's labors were not well acknowledged. After his death, he was only partially recognized by historians of the age, including the Venerable Bede in Britain, as an obscure supporter of the church. In their descriptions of Cassiodorus, medieval scholars often documented often rather changed his name, his profession, his place of residence. Some chapters from his works even were copied into other texts accidentally, suggesting that he may have been read but not generally known. And because he had been working under the newly dominant power of the Ostrogoths, Cassiodorus demonstrably alters the narrative of history for the sake of protecting himself when he writes about current events. The same could easily be said about his ideas, which were presented as non-threatening in their approach to peaceful reflection and its institutional isolationism. Essentially, what Cassiodorus saw himself as, and it's something that I, on a personal note, and I'll end on this for tonight, I can relate to a lot, is that he recognized that he was on the verge of a great dark age. And if I were to compare anything to where we are right now in our moment in history, it would be exactly on such a precipice. He saw that the greatness of the Roman Empire had become a thing of the past by his time, and that the best thing he could possibly do was gather together a large library, Greek and Latin texts, sacred and profane, and put them together and teach them to his students, and to try to preserve a little bit of that light of classical Christian learning and pass it on to the next generation. And this essentially is the way I view my own career, my own enterprise. Really, essentially, in exactly the same situation. Although I hate to say it, I think we're in perhaps a worse one. We don't have tribes of barbarians rampaging all around, but we have something worse in a sense. We have the dumbing down of our culture. We have a lack of interest in anything. At least on some level, these barbaric hordes, they did at least acknowledge the worthiness of the ideal of civilization. But we live in an age where even that itself has been denigrated to the point of oblivion. And I don't want to end on such a down note, but perhaps the best thing we could possibly say is that he was able to effect a transference and a continuum of classical culture, and we can hold him up as a model for that, for our age, and look to him for inspiration. And with that, my friends, we will continue in our next lecture as we see the next historical period where the transference of the same ideal of classical Christian learning is carried over into the Renaissance. Thank you.